I think that's a good signal. Good evening and welcome to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I'm David Brigham, the librarian and CEO here at HSP. I'm going to start off with a few housekeeping events. We are in a hybrid format. We have guests online this evening, and everyone here will have access to the full content of this evening's lecture. If you're viewing online, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your taskbar if you would like to receive closed captions. We'll be recording this evening's presentation, and a link will be sent out to everyone who registered, whether you're here or online, so that you can watch the lecture again if you missed something or would just like to absorb it more deeply. We'll have time at the end of this evening's program for a few questions and answers. That takes care of our housekeeping. 2026 is a very exciting year for the nation and certainly for HSP. We began celebrating actually last year with the exhibits and programs marking the 250th anniversaries of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and the United States Navy and Marines, all founded here in Philadelphia and richly documented in the collections of HSP. Opening tonight, we are pleased to present Paths to Independence, 1765 to 1787, which examines the many points of view that emerged during the decade before and after the Declaration of Independence. It has been a privilege to collaborate on this project with Professor of Law William Ewald from the University of Pennsylvania over the last 3 years. Bill, where are you? Here's Bill Ewald. And Bill has been my co-curator, and we have worked countless hours together on this, and it's been a real joy to do so. We combed through thousands of documents, newspapers, broadsides, pamphlets, cartoons, and other primary sources to tell the stories of the Revolutionary era. We tried to capture those stories from many different points of view, not only the founders that we all grew up learning about, but the founding mothers, to borrow Mary Beth Norton's phrase, Native voices, African-American voices, even the voices of school children who wrote a student newspaper, which is on view downstairs, from 1777 to 1778 during the American Revolution. Ultimately, we selected 140 items, all from HSP's astonishing collections that are arranged chronologically in 4 cases and then thematically in 3 additional wall cases. Just as we completed the checklist and declared a sort of moral victory, I received an email from my colleague and friend, Carol Soltis, who's here with us this evening. Carol brought to my attention, Carol and I, by the way, share a longtime scholarly interest and devotion to the Peale family of artists. I wrote my dissertation on Charles Wilson Peale, and Carol has worked on important exhibitions of the Peale family, Rembrandt Peale right here at HSP, and many, many other projects. She's made important discoveries and contributions to the field. She, in this email, brought to my attention the painting by James Peale that is on view downstairs, representing the burning of the Peggy Stewart, a tea ship that came into Annapolis Harbor in October of 1774. And we believe that painting has not been seen in public since 1851. And it's here for the first time on public view in 175 years. It's documented, and Carol was able to find much of that documentation, some of it here at HSP. We all know about the Boston Tea Party, and the exhibit already had evidence of the Philadelphia tea protest in early December of 73. But here is this Annapolis event being exhibited and painted, we think, from an eyewitness account of the artist James Peale. Paths to Independence is generously funded by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities through their Democracy Demands Wisdom program. We also receive support from the Philadelphia for the Semi-Quincentennial, a fund of the National Philanthropic Trust, and the William Penn Foundation, which provided a valuable planning grant that enabled us to work in collaboration with our friends at Penn, the American Philosophical Society, the Library Company, and the Museum of the American Revolution. Now for our speaker. We begin our program this evening with a lecture by the renowned historian Mary Beth Norton, whose book 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, deeply influenced my understanding of the complexity of the years prior to the Declaration of Independence and really helped to shape the conversations that Bill and I had in the selection of documents and the stories that we wanted to tell. In her book, Mary Beth, and I won't steal her whole story here, but just a quick note or two, explains how each of the 13 American colonies that signed the Declaration of Independence came to that decision to do so in very different ways and for different reasons. While ambiguous thinking was possible, fuzzy thinking in the 1760s and early 70s, critical events such as the Boston Tea Party and the battles of Lexington and Concord forced Americans to solidify their thinking and to declare their position. In addition to 1774, Professor Norton's previous books have expanded our knowledge of founding mothers and the Salem witch crisis. Please welcome our distinguished speaker, the Mary Beth Donlin Alger Professor Emerita of American History at Cornell University, Mary Beth Norton.
David, for that lovely introduction. I have to say, I'm thrilled to see that picture of the burning of the Peggy Stewart, which I wrote about in 1774. I have to say, if you haven't seen it or you don't know about it, the Peggy Stewart went completely up in flames, and it was actually burned by its owner. And it was claimed afterwards that he voluntarily did it. There's a lot of coercion involved. Working on the Sounds good. Okay, so I'll just say that the owner of the Peggy Stewart was coerced into agreeing to set fire to his own ship, which had other things on it in addition to tea, I might add. He had brought a bunch of indentured servants to Annapolis, and he later claimed that he agreed to the burning of the ship to be able to get the indentured servants off the ship because they were stuck on there. And he had to agree to shall we say, a negotiated settlement with the local people who were upset about the tea arriving to get them to allow him to take the indentured servants off the ship. They also claimed that they would hang him outside his pregnant wife's window if he didn't do it. This is why I say this was not a voluntary act on his part. So let me just comment a little bit about the title tonight, 1774 and all that. Some of you may recognize that there's a very famous kind of cheeky book of English history called 1066 and all that. And that's what I was building off of in that title. And my intent tonight is to talk to people who first, some of whom I know have read the book 1774 and some of whom who have not. And I don't like to always repeat things in talks that I've already said in print. So in fact, what you're getting tonight is a backstory for the writing of 1774, plus to prepare this talk, I actually went back to my original notes, and there's things in the talk that are not in the book. So if you've memorized the book, you'll find things in this that you didn't know about. Now, so as everyone in Philadelphia, or at least those who are here tonight, and those who are watching online surely know by now, this is in fact the 250th anniversary of the passage of the Declaration of Independence. And we are specifically approaching that anniversary 58 days from now. I looked that up. Now, the Second Continental Congress voted for independence on July 2nd, 1776, and of course formally adopted the Declaration on July 4th. Now, maybe people here know, or maybe you don't, that July 2nd, not July 4th, was the date that John Adams wrote at the time, quote, ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. Now, when people quote him today, it's almost always implied, if not wrongly asserted, that he was referring to the 4th. I did hear just on NPR, like I think yesterday or the day before, someone talking about, well, the fact that Adams was wrong when he said it was the 2nd of July. In fact, he was right, because July 2nd is the date that independence was voted for. It was not the date the Declaration was formally adopted, but it was the date that independence was formally voted. And of course, we all know that the Declaration was initially drafted here in Philadelphia by Thomas Jefferson, with later changes and amendments offered by other members of a committee or by the entire Congress. I'll just insert the fact, here's previews of coming attractions. There's a new book coming called The King's Slaves by a brilliant historian named Holly Brewer, and she shows that, in fact, Jefferson was right to claim in the Declaration of Independence draft that was dumped by the Congress that, in fact, the king had been responsible for establishing and perpetuating slavery in the colonies. It's just an amazing piece of work, and it's going to be published by Princeton University Press with a blurb on it from me, which is why I know that I've read the advanced copy, and it really is extraordinary. I recommend it to all of you. And the other book I recommend to all of you, if you haven't read it, is Pauline Mayer's excellent book, American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence, which is a brilliant piece of work that Pauline told me had been, in subsequent years, that people thought she'd won a prize for it. She didn't. She should have won a prize for it. She ended up winning a prize for her next book after that, called Ratification, about the ratification of the Constitution. But she really should have won the prize for American Scripture. So anyway, for this year, with good reason, Philadelphia institutions, including the Historical Society, the Museum of the American Revolution, the National Constitution Center, and the American Philosophical Society are all marking the 250th anniversary of the Declaration with special exhibitions. But I will assert tonight that Philadelphia could just as well have celebrated 2023 or 2024 for each equally justifiable reasons, which I learned during my research for my book, 1774. Although Boston's actions in late 1773 and 1774 typically get all the attention from historians and the general public, I'm here to tell you that Philadelphians deserve just as much, if not more, commendation than Bostonians when we think about the origins of the fight for independence. So I'm sure everyone in Philadelphia will like this. I hope you like this story that I'm going to tell tonight. Now, I need to explain how and why I became aware of Philadelphia's early and largely unknown prominence in the period in which the decade-long resistance to British policy, starting with opposition to the Stamp and Townshend Acts in the 1760s, developed quite rapidly after 1773 into an armed struggle for independence. And as will become apparent in my narrative this evening, timing is important. That is, not necessarily the timing of events themselves, but rather the timing of when those events became widely known, especially between Britain and America, or between one colony and another. I begin with how, as a sometime resident of New England, I nevertheless became aware that New Englanders did not deserve full credit or possibly the blame for the key events of the early days of the conflict with Great Britain. In fact, my interest in the events of the year 1774, which ended up with my book that was published in 2020, goes back to my work on my PhD dissertation in the mid to late 1960s. Here's the backstory. So at the suggestion of my Harvard mentor, Bernard Bailyn, I decided to focus my dissertation on the Loyalists of the Revolution. I then chose to study the Loyalist exiles who moved to Great Britain during the war. That required me to live in London for an extended period, which I must admit was my plan all along, since I had fallen in love with London on my first visit as a tourist a couple of years before. And I admit this, by the way, I admitted this for years to my graduate students, that I chose my dissertation topic, in fact, in part because it required me to live in London. Now, while doing that research on the Loyalists, I realized how important the events of 1774 were for dividing the American populace. Studies of Loyalists and revolutionaries have often identified those divisions as starting with the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 or even earlier. There are people who argue that it's really started in the 1740s. But reading about the Americans who identified as Loyalists and went into exile voluntarily or involuntarily convinced me that earlier political disagreements over imperial policy did not necessarily map onto later divisions between Loyalists and Patriots. In short, some leaders of resistance in the 1760s and 1770s were among those who ended up remaining loyal to the crown. And some initial supporters of royal authority were alienated by Britain's responses to Americans' actions. And that, of course, is after the talk, the narrative I'm telling tonight. But I concluded, back when I was working on my dissertation, that almost all the colonists, with few, if any, exceptions, could be described as loyal Britons as late as the beginning of the year 1774. But by the end of that year, circumstances had changed dramatically. And so for my dissertation and first book, I spent hours crafting an initial sentence. I think it took me a whole morning to write the sentence I'm about to read to you. It's one that I explicitly repeated as an epigraph to the introduction of the book 1774. So here's that sentence that took me so long to write. The year 1774 dawned 16 days after the Boston Tea Party, and by the time its 12 months ended, the royal provincial governments were in disarray. The First Continental Congress had convened and adjourned, and the battles of Lexington and Concord were just 3.5 months in the future, end quote. Now, to me, writing in the 1960s and still today, that summary succinctly describes the significant changes that occurred during the crucial year that concerned me and later my recent book. Yet, as it happened, scholars examining the origins of the revolution did not in the 1960s pay detailed attention to the events of 1774. And for the most part, with very few exceptions other than my own work, they still have not done that. There still isn't very much work done on what happened in 1774. So in my book, I stretched the time period to include the 16 months between October 1773, when the colonists learned that ships carrying East India Company tea would be arriving on their shores, and the outbreak of fighting in April 1775. Thus, in the book's title, I dubbed 1774 the long year of revolution. Academics will recognize the trope of scholars who refer to the long 18th century and mean the years between 1688 and 1815. I deliberately built on that with my own phrase. So unsurprisingly, given the insights I gained from my dissertation research into what happened in 1774, when I completed my work on the Loyalist exiles, I planned to study the events of that year more closely. The book on 1774 was going to be my second book. So at that time, I was teaching at the University of Connecticut, but after 2 years at UConn, I moved to Cornell, and that move changed my scholarly trajectory. First, I became involved with a group of female faculty members from fields like literature, sociology, and psychology, who were trying to set up a women's studies program. They introduced me to the beginnings of feminist scholarship in their disciplines. Second, a few early articles on American women's history began to appear in the journals I read regularly, all focused on the early 19th century or the 1820s, 1830s, that sort of thing. The authors tended to make assumptions about women's lives in the preceding century that I thought were erroneous, even though I had never explicitly studied women. But I had read correspondence to and from women who were related to the male loyalists, who had been my primary interest. And I had also read and taken notes on claims from widows submitted to the Loyalist Claims Commission in Great Britain after the war. So I decided to write an article about American women in the late 18th century to show people how wrong they were. But within a few months, it became clear it had to be a book. So Liberty's Daughters was published in 1980, and it's still in print with Cornell University Press, I might add. Its original publisher was not Cornell. It went through a variety of publishers before it came to Cornell. But more importantly for this origin story, it led me to subsequent decades of work on gender and women in the 17th century, far away from my initial research plan. Ultimately, that then led me to the study of the Salem witchcraft crisis of 1692, which became the key predecessor for my return to my long-time interest in the year 1774. Now, that observation might seem peculiar or even outlandish. How could a book on witchcraft in 1692 affect one on the run-up in the American Revolution in 1774? And the answer lies in how both books are organized. When I first proposed a book on the Salem trials, I planned a series of topical chapters. I still have in a file a copy of my initial proposal to the publisher, and it's very different from the book I ended up writing. That's because I realized while taking notes from the legal records that I needed a clear understanding of the chronology of the crisis, which was hard to discern from the records and from previous books, all of which had been organized around some kind of topic. If any of you have read books about Salem, they're all organized topically in some way or other. So I created a detailed calendar of events for 1692 on my laptop. This wasn't necessarily really easy because it was a different calendar from the one we use now. It was the Julian calendar, not the Gregorian calendar, so everything was different. I had to find a list that gave me what day of the week the dates fell on, so I could create this calendar. I later on discovered I could have found something online, but I didn't know that at the time. So unbeknownst to me, Marilyn Roach was at the same time preparing a day-to-day summary of the Salem crisis. Her book appeared in print in 2002, about the same time as mine. And our books were followed in 2010 by the definitive edition of the legal records, also organized chronologically. Now, it's a different chronology from the chronology of when things happened, because it was the chronology of when things were described in court. And that's a different chronology from when things happened. But nevertheless, if either of these books, either Marilyn Roach's book or the legal book, had appeared before I did my work, it would have made my task a great deal easier, because I had to put everything together little by little. Now, the chronology that I created as a tool for understanding the dynamics of 1692 ended up being the crucial element in the book. I never intended it to be when I started doing the chronology, but it ended up being that. In the Devil's Snare has two key characteristics that differentiate it from the books about the crisis that preceded it and from most that have followed it. First, it was largely chronological and primarily narrative in focus. Second, it presented the events of 1692, 1693 entirely as contemporaries viewed them. I deliberately described the developments in the crisis in terms used by the participants. I deferred offering my own interpretations until the very end of the book. Because most books about Salem have very elaborate psychological or other kinds of explanations, I just didn't do that at all. So, having successfully composed a narrative of the Salem crisis, organized chronologically, and recognizing what I had gained from doing that, when I returned to my idea of writing about 1774, I did so intending from the outset to create a similar narrative. I completely changed the conception of the book that I had left undeveloped for many years, which had focused on the biographies of individuals involved in the actions of 1774, not on an overarching chronology. Now, because of my prior work on the Loyalists, I of course wanted to give more attention than other narratives of the period did, and to them. That also meant paying attention to political moderates like the Pennsylvanian John Dickinson, not just to radical leaders like the Bostonian Samuel Adams, who have traditionally been the focal point of discussions of the period. So for 1774, I adopted the same strategy I did with the Salem book. That is, I stuck to developments at the time in North America rather than providing a comprehensive narrative informed by subsequent historical scholarship. One of the crucial consequences of that decision is that the people in my narrative in the book only know what is going on in England or in other colonies when someone writes to tell them that, or when they have read it in a newspaper account. So I am not an omniscient author in this book. I wanted the readers, I wanted the readers to not know to forget how the story came out and just to read it as it happened. So that's the way I told the story. Now, another aspect of my analysis in the book is relevant, and it too is directly related to chronology. During the Watergate affair of the mid-1970s, the Congressional Committee investigating Richard Nixon famously asked a critical question about his involvement in the break-in and the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate complex. What did the president know, and when did he know it? You've probably all heard that question. There are those of us who are old enough to remember when it was asked, but anyway, I have modified that question and applied it to the history of the tea controversy in 1773 and to the Revolution as a whole. What did the colonists know, and when did they know it? So the thrust of my narrative is therefore not simply reconstructing the sequence of events, but also identifying when the Americans learned of certain events and how they responded to that knowledge. Now, many people who've read the book, in fact, including one I've already talked to here tonight, have told me that that was been an important and enlightening part of the book for them. We are all so familiar today with instant information, even about events far from our localities. It's hard sometimes to imagine how long it took in the 18th century for accurate news to travel in America or across the Atlantic. And here I'll just tell you a story. David McCullough was a friend of mine, and when he was first starting to work on the Addams Family, we had breakfast together, and he said to me over breakfast that he was astounded at how long it took John Quincy Adams, who was then the President of the United States, to learn about the death of his father, John Adams, in July of 1826. Because it had just never occurred to him, because he'd never worked in an earlier period before, how long it took information to travel. So it was an important revelation to David, and it's something that conversation is something I've remembered for a number of years. So I learned an important lesson from In the Devil's Snare, the first chronologically organized book that I wrote, and I applied that lesson to 1774. Developing the same sort of chronology for the recent book reaped rewards by leading me to several revelatory findings, especially to key ones involving Philadelphia, which I'm going to talk about tonight. In fact, I learned that Philadelphians in many ways deserve the prominence Boston now holds in most narratives of the early days of the Revolution, including in Ken Burns' recent popular documentary film, which, as you all know, ignores the city until rather late in the day. So what I gained this by paying close attention to dates, which is, after all, a historian's key stock in trade. So with that sort of introduction, let me talk about the importance of Philadelphia. I started by figuring out when and how Americans first learned that ships carrying tea directly from the East India Company were being dispatched to the colonies. The cargoes on those ships were sent to designated agents who became known as tea consignees, who were expected to distribute the tea to individual merchants. The new policy, intended to change the way tea was sold in America, was adopted by Parliament in April 1773 and signed into law by King George III in May. Now, it will not surprise any of you. Well, several things might surprise you. I don't know. One of them that may not surprise you is that the East India Company, which was a legal monopoly of tea sales in the colonies or in England, was almost in bankruptcy in 1773. It needed to be saved. And what will not surprise you is that, guess what? Members of Parliament were stockholders in the East India Company, and so they wanted to save it. Why was it near bankruptcy? It was near bankruptcy for a couple of reasons. One was the law required the East India Company to sell its tea at public auction in London after the tea had been introduced into Britain and had paid a tax coming into Britain. And at that public auction, the tea could be bought by retailers or wholesalers, either one. But in any event, the East India Company could not control the price of the tea. It was all dependent on what happened in the auction. So that was the first issue. The East India Company could not control the amount of what the tea was being sold for, or what it was being bought for. The other problem, and was partly caused by that, was the fact that the East India Company was up against massive smuggling by the Dutch. The Dutch West India Company, which didn't care about the English law at all, was behind the smuggling of huge amounts of Dutch tea into Britain itself and into the colonies. And when I say Dutch tea, it was always referred to that, but it was from China, just as the East India Company tea was from. And the smuggled tea sold for considerably less than the legal tea being sold under the auspices of the East India Company. In fact, nobody knows exactly, it's very hard to know exactly what the smuggled tea was sold for, but the people who've studied this say maybe about half the cost of the East India Company's legal tea. So you get the idea. The East India Company was unable to sell much of its tea, even though the Americans were, and the word was used at the time, prodigious tea drinkers. They were all drinking smuggled tea, as far as anybody can tell. So the first news of the new East India Act, the Tea Act, that reached the colonies came not as an official announcement from two governors from the American Secretary, Lord Dartmouth, but rather in a personal letter sent from London in May 1773, in other words, the month that the king signed the law, by a New York merchant to a friend in Philadelphia. An excerpt from that letter initially appeared in the Pennsylvania Gazette on August 11th, 1773. Let me emphasize the dates and the circumstances. The consequential news of the Tea Act's adoption in May did not arrive in the colonies for 3 more months, and then it was published not as an official announcement, but as an extract from a private letter from one merchant to another. And this had a lot to do with the fact that the printers of newspapers would publish little excerpts from all kinds of letters that had interesting information, not just from London, but from other places, because the printers made their offices the post offices. And so people would come in to get their mail, they would open the mail, and they would say to the printer, oh, guess what I just found in this letter, isn't this interesting? And then the printer would print that in the next issue of the newspaper. And that's how a lot of these stories were carried out. So it then took a month, from late August to late September, I tracked it, for the same excerpt to be published by the printers of newspapers all the way from Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the north to Charleston, South Carolina in the south. I never found a similar imprint in the newspaper, the one newspaper in Savannah, Georgia, but each notice was headed Philadelphia, August 11th. Everything was exactly the same. Here's what the letter said. I have no idea who the Philadelphian addressee was. People have figured out who the New Yorker was, but other people haven't figured out who the Philadelphian was. Here's what the letter said, as quoted in the Pennsylvania Gazette and reprinted verbatim in other newspapers. Quote, I take the first opportunity of acquainting you that the East India Company have obtained leave by Act of Parliament to export their teas from England duty-free, and in a short time, perhaps a month, a cargo will be sent by them to Boston, subject to the duty payable in America, to be sold in that place on their account. And they mean to keep America so well supplied that the train to Holland for that article must be greatly affected, end quote. So this letter accurately conveyed the intent of the law, which was destroying the market for the so-called smuggled Dutch tea, and for its tax provisions, because the East India Company, I didn't mention this, the East India Company would avoid paying the tea tax in Britain, but the Americans would have to pay when they purchased. It was a different tax, but the East India Company was told it wouldn't have to pay the tax when it brought the tea to Britain if it re-exported the tea to America, and then the Americans would pay a different tax when the tea arrived. But it also contained tea errors. First, the author greatly underestimated the time it would take the East India Company to collect the cargo. Remember, he wrote in May and thought it would be a month until the cargo was sent, but in fact, it wasn't until very late in the fall that the cargoes took off. And then secondly, it only named Boston as a destination for the tea. But the East India Company had also targeted Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston as destinations for tea shipments. More specific information about the East India Company's plans and the 7 ships that would carry the tea trickled slowly in over the next 2 months, appearing in other reprinted letters and newspaper reports from London in different colonies, which I will not go into in detail. When a copy of the Act itself was first printed in New York in early September, nobody paid much attention to it because the language of the Act was tangled and very hard to understand. Indeed, it was initially misread, as became apparent in New York City broadside exchanges that I talk about in the book. The first report that the tea was being sent to New York and Philadelphia was not published until early October. Remember, Boston had known since mid-August that it was getting a tea ship, but it was not until October that people in New York and Philadelphia knew that tea was coming to them, and Charleston was only identified as a recipient on October 13th, and that report appeared not in Charleston, but in Philadelphia, and so it was, in fact, because of the distance of Charleston from other ports, when news almost always arrived later, the Charleston residents only had about 2 weeks' notice before the tea ship arrived on their shore. So because of the way the news was transmitted, Charlestonians didn't really know what was happening until almost before it happened. Now, Americans today would assume, the way we think about the Tea Act, that the news of the Tea Act, whenever it arrived, would arouse immediate opposition, especially in Boston. But that's mistaken. Rather, the first essays calling for resistance to the act appeared where? Philadelphia, not in Boston. And it appeared in New York, too. One appeared in New York, but the publication in New York took an approach criticizing the East India Company less for the tea than for its policies in India that no other colonies adopted, so I'm not going to talk about that. There's a new book that's going to talk about that, but I didn't. Now, therefore, and I want to underscore to everybody here, the most important early protests about the East India Company's plans were published in mid-October 1773 here in Philadelphia, not in Boston. Significantly, that was before the colonists learned for certain that tea ships were actually on their way. It turns out that the ships left British ports in late September, but that news did not reach any colony until for some weeks. So when Samuel Adams and the Boston Committee of Correspondence learned of the Tea Act, and I saw this letter, they were, in retrospect, remarkably unconcerned about the news of the ship's impending arrival. The Bostonians did not think much that was of very importance of the Tea Act. It didn't arouse any controversy, particularly in Boston. Only after the 2 Philadelphia essays were reprinted in the Boston papers did Adams and his associates express opposition to the act. So, who were the Philadelphia authors, and when and what did they argue? The first publication was a broadside written by the Quaker merchant Thomas Mifflin under a pseudonym, and it appeared on October 9th and was later published as an essay in newspapers throughout the colonies. Mifflin likened the tea consignees to the men who had been designated as distributors of tax stamps in 1765, all of whom had been forced to resign by crowd action. So he called on the consignees to voluntarily surrender their appointments. He did not make an explicit threat, but his meaning was nevertheless clear. It basically said, here are the tea consignees. They should resign. And by the way, all the stamp distributors were forced to resign by mobs in 1765. QED, even though he didn't say it explicitly. So he certainly implied that the tea consignees could expect to receive the same treatment. The second essay, which was published 2 days later in Dunlap's Pennsylvania Packet, by the young physician Benjamin Rush, contended that East India Company tea should not be allowed to land. So he didn't really talk about the tea consignees. He said, forget the consignees, we shouldn't let the tea land. Rush warned that if the tea were landed, customers would buy it because he knew how much the colonists liked their tea. They had been paying no attention to the law that said they should buy from the East India Company all along, so why would they pay attention to the people who were ignoring the Tea Act? And so he lamented, and I love his language here, "Farewell, American liberty. We are undone forever," because Americans' purchases would admit Parliament's authority to tax the colonies. He urged, quote, "Let us with one heart and hand oppose the landing of it," end quote. He concluded with an emotional appeal, quote, "It may seem overwrought to us today, but this is it, in 1773. Remember, my countrymen, perhaps the present struggle will fix the Constitution of America forever. Think of your ancestors and of your posterity," end quote. Now, not all Philadelphia authors agreed with Mifflin and Rush. In late October, John Dickinson, the moderate whom I mentioned earlier, proposed a more passive response than either of his two predecessors. He suggested merely that people should not cooperate in the unloading or sale of the tea. He did not advocate formal opposition. But before his essay appeared in print, Philadelphians had already started to act against the tea imports under the law. So just 5 days after Rush's article appeared, a large meeting convened at the Pennsylvania State House, reportedly called by William Bradford, who was the publisher of the Pennsylvania Journal and the author of A Coffee House. I have to say, this is a later statement that Bradford convened this meeting. There's no contemporary evidence of how the meeting was called, but a descendant of his said he was behind it. So that's the best evidence we have. I'm not sure I believe it, but in any event, that's what it says. Now, the meeting at the State House formally adopted several resolutions, beginning with the assertion that, quote, "the disposal of their own property is the inherent right of freemen," end quote, and so property cannot be taken without their consent. Quote, "Thus the claim of Parliament to tax America is, in other words, a claim of right to levy contributions on us at pleasure," end quote. The resolutions called for, quote, "a virtuous and steady opposition to the ministerial plan of governing America, which constituted, quote, a violent attack on the liberties of America." This is all language adopted by this large meeting in Philadelphia. Adopting a version of Rush's language, one resolution insisted that opposition to the tea was a duty which every free man in America owes to his country, to himself, and to his posterity, end quote. Didn't mention ancestors the way Rush had, but you get the same idea. The meeting went on to declare that each tea consignee was, quote, a tea enemy to was a enemy to his country, and it named a committee to meet with those Philadelphia merchants who had been given the odious commission to receive the tea. That committee's charge was to convince them to reject the commission, which they all did, although one firm delayed complying for several weeks. Accordingly, by targeting the consignees, Philadelphians started by adopting Mifflin's tactical suggestion rather than Rush's. So what of Boston, you might well ask? Where were the Bostonians in mid-1773? Well, there were a couple of essays published in the radical Boston newspapers that really said this Tea Act is a bad idea, but they didn't propose anything to do about it. Now, those locally authored essays do not appear to have roused Bostonians to act. Instead, the publications that had major impacts in the city were the later reprints from Philadelphia. First, one in the October 25th Boston Gazette, which was Thomas Mifflin's explicit reference to 1765 crowd action, and then in the Boston Evening Post on November 8th, Rush's argument against landing the tea in the first place. So on November 1st, after the first reprinted publication, but before the second, a group of Boston men demanded that the tea consignees in their town resign, and they drew an explicit analogy to 1765 by asking the merchants to appear at the Liberty Tree on the Common, which had been done in the Stamp Act demonstrations earlier. But unlike their Philadelphia counterparts, the consignees resisted the crowd's demands. They did not resign. They did not show up at the Liberty Tree. Then on November 5th, which is 4 days after the first attack on the consignees in Boston, the Boston town meeting considered what to do. And I have to say, when I read the resolutions that the Bostonians adopted, I thought to myself, I've read this before. And I was right. Because what the Bostonians did was to adopt what the Philadelphians had said 3 weeks earlier. And they said, quote, "The words of certain judicious resolves lately entered into by our worthy brethren, the citizens of Philadelphia, perfectly reflect our views." So they too initially adopted for Mifflin's proposed tactic, which is trying to force the consignees to resign, as the stamp distributors had done. Then a Boston crowd in mid-November went further by attacking the house and warehouse of one of the consignees, scaring the members of his family, but injuring nobody. So that was Boston. Okay, let's go back to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, people were dissatisfied with relying on the tea consignee resignations alone. And so residents began to take steps to implement Rush's suggestion as well as Mifflin's, now that the tea agents there had complied with the demands to quit. In mid-November, a group of men aggressively terming themselves, quote, "the Committee for Tarring and Feathering," end quote, issued the first of 2 broadsides directed to pilots on the Delaware River, in which any tea ship would have to traverse before arriving in town. The broadsides revealed that the identity of the Philadelphia-bound tea ship and its captain had been discovered. The Polly was the tea ship, and it was, quote, "an old black ship." And it was under the command of Captain Ayres, and the broadsides described him variously, either short and fat or thick and chunky, end quote. That was how the broadsides described him. And this was the vessel that was en route for London with the detested tea. One of the broadsides said, quote, "There is some talk of a handsome reward awaiting the pilot who first sees and reports the ship." Now notice that. There is some talk of a handsome reward. It doesn't say there will be a handsome reward. It says there is some talk of it. So that is sort of laid out as a possibility. But what is even more certain is what they said, quote, "tar and feathers will be the portion of anyone who pilots her into this harbor," end quote. So in other words, you might get a reward, but you will definitely be tarred and feathered if you, Delaware pilot, dare bring the ship into our harbor. Now, with that warning in the broadsides, matters rested while the Polly sailed toward Philadelphia, and the city's residents anxiously waited for its arrival. They knew the ship, they knew the captain, but nobody had seen it, and nobody knew when it was going to arrive. And so everyone was anxious, and I've read the letters from Philadelphia at that time, and they expressed this great anxiety. What's going to happen? We don't know when the ship is coming. We don't know what's going to happen. Now, meanwhile, back to Boston. Faithfully, three tea ships began entering Boston Harbor, arriving between November 28th and December 7th. A fourth ship bound for Boston was caught in a storm and wrecked on Cape Cod on the morning of December 11th. I'll talk some more about that story later. I and others have described in numerous books and articles what happened next in Boston to the 3 vessels that successfully docked there. The basic outlines of the tale of the so-called Boston Tea Party are well known today. On the night of December 16th, a large group of men, loosely described as Indians, boarded the ships and broke open the more than 300 chests of tea they carried. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tea by modern standards, modern counting. They threw the tea overboard. But tea details are missing from that popular story, and I'm going to focus on just 2. First, on November 29th and 30th, Bostonians held a 2-day town meeting to discuss what to do about the lone tea ship. At that point, there's still just one tea ship that had arrived. The lone tea ship then tied up at the wharf. It was later that the other ships arrived. Adopting the approach that Rush had advocated in the essay that had been reprinted in Boston 3 weeks earlier, participants voted unanimously to prevent the tea from landing and to ensure that it was sent back to England. Now, so the town's discussions centered on how do we do this? How do we stop the tea from landing, and how do we get the ship to go back? The Boston townsmen selected a crucial tactic, recruiting men to keep a 24-hour watch on the wharf to make certain that tea chests were not removed from the ship then in the harbor and from those that were expected to arrive later. So they got volunteers to set up a 24/7 watch on the wharf. But secondly, the standoff could not continue indefinitely. Under the customs laws, duty had to be paid on arriving cargoes within 20 days of ships entering a harbor. If no duty was paid, the cargo would be confiscated by customs officers. And that's, in fact, what led to the problem of the Peggy Stewart, because he had to do something to get those indentured servants off the ship. And the only way he could do that was by paying the tea duty, and that's what did him in and why they made him burn the ship. So, as it happened, so if no duty was paid, the cargo would be confiscated by customs officers. As it happened, December 16th was the 19th day. So on December 20th, there could have been a confrontation at the tea ships between the customs officers and British troops that were then stationed in Boston on the one side and colonists on the other. That's why the destruction of the tea, which was what it was called at the time, not the Boston Tea Party, the destruction of the tea had to happen when it did the night of December 16th in order to avoid a confrontation with British soldiers and customs officers. Now, there's another story that I tell in the first chapter, which I go into, which is that and I'll just say briefly, a tea ship had arrived in Charleston shortly after the tea ships began to arrive in Boston. But in Charleston, the people in Charleston could not make up their mind what to do. And so literally, because they couldn't make up their mind, they never set a watch on the wharf, and they basically stood around while the customs officers confiscated the tea after the 20 days were up. And the customs officers reported this happened they just stood around and watched. All the locals just stood around and watched while we unloaded all the tea from the ship. And then what happened was the customs officers loaded the tea into the exchange building on Charleston Harbor. You can see that building is still there today. And years later, the Americans sold it to help finance the revolution. But that's what happened to the tea that went to Charleston at the same time. But, okay, so that's what happened. In Boston, they destroyed the tea. In Charleston, the tea was confiscated by the customs officers. Well, let's go back to Philadelphia, still waiting for the Polly to arrive while the tea was happening, while the destruction and the confiscation was happening elsewhere. Philadelphia, before this moment, had only minimal information about the other cities, just the beginning of the news that tea ships had arrived. Again, it takes a long time for the news to get back and forth, even by sea along the coast. On the morning of December 17th, the Boston Committee of Correspondence dispatched the news of the destruction of the tea via their messenger, Paul Revere, sending him south to New York, which he reached on December 21st. And then to Philadelphia, where he arrived on December 24th. Coincidentally, news that the Polly had been seen in the river also arrived in Philadelphia on the 24th. The Pennsylvania Gazette, you can see it if you see this issue of the Pennsylvania Gazette, added a postscript dated 2 o'clock in the afternoon to the issue that was already impressed with the information from Boston describing the final town meeting on the evening of December 16th and the events of that night. Now, weeks before, quote, a great number of respectable inhabitants. I mean, I love the phrases, I have to say, in the Philadelphia papers here, and I'll have some more to say that in a minute. A great number of respectable inhabitants in Philadelphia had already decided that they would try to prevent the Polly from formally entering its cargo at the customs house, thus avoiding any activation of this troublesome 20-day legal deadline. They either foresaw the problem facing Boston and Charleston, or maybe they learned about it or whatever. It's not clear whether they knew about it beforehand, but they decided that they didn't want the ships to enter, the Polly to enter the harbor. They knew they had to intercept the tea ship before it reached Philadelphia and registered its presence at the customs house. All the river pilots had indeed refused to assist the Polly in its passage up the river. So without a pilot, but reportedly following another vessel, the tea ship made its way to Chester, where it stopped on December 25th. So the next day, December 26th, Gilbert Barclay, who was a tea consignee who had traveled from London on board the vessel, disembarked to make his way by land into the city of Philadelphia. Now, from here on, I want to quote as much of the story from the Pennsylvania Gazette as possible to give you a flavor of how the encounters among Barclay, Captain Ayres, and the Philadelphians were reported and understood at the time. I'm going to interject some comments by two customs officers and also my own interpretation of the published statements. Now, according to the Gazette, Barclay, quote, politely met with the representatives of the town who, quote, acquainted him with the sentiments of the city and the danger to which the public liberties of America were exposed by this law, end quote. Think of that. They acquainted him with the sentiments of the city and the danger to which the public liberties of America were exposed by this law. Barclay then described, quote, the particular hardship of his situation and resigned his commission as a consignee, quote, in a manner which affected everyone present, end quote. Now, in the 18th century, that usually meant somebody was crying or at least breaking down mentally in front of them. So one can imagine poor Gilbert Barclay, he's the tea consignee, and he's telling them, okay, I will resign, you're making me do it, but it's going to destroy my business, my family, I'm going to be bankrupt, whatever. So who knows exactly what he said, but it affected as a manner that affected everyone present, end quote. They didn't ask him to change his mind, but anyway. All right, so the Polly then proceeded, so that was the 26th. So the Polly then proceeded further up the river on the 27th, and other committee members intercepted it. To quote the Gazette's much reprinted account, and this is reprinted in a lot of other newspapers, at the outskirts of the city, Captain Ayres, quote, was handed through a lane made by the people to the gentleman appointed to confer with him. Okay, so just envision a crowd of angry Philadelphians yelling and shouting at the captain, and a lane has to be made for him to get through them to go to the committee that is going to meet with him. In the street, the Gazette admitted, boys showed him, quote, I love this phrase, some small rudeness, end quote. Now, no, this is winter. They probably threw snowballs at him. That's what I think is going on. But a published account states, quote, several gentlemen interposed and suppressed it before he received the least injury, end quote. The committee members then explained to the captain, quote, here we go again about the sentiments, the general sentiments together with the danger and difficulties that would attend his refusal to comply with the wishes of the inhabitants, end quote. So we can imagine Captain Ayres, who's not a tea consignee, he's just a captain, and he's told, you better comply. So according to the two customs officers, the committee then escorted Captain Ayres, quote, in a kind of custody, end quote, into the heart of the city. And there, said the Pennsylvania Gazette, he was quickly convinced of the, quote, truth and propriety of what he had been told. I can imagine how large the crowd was there. The customs officers described, quote, the whole city as being in a violent ferment and determined not to allow the tea to be landed. The captain wisely and unsurprisingly agreed to cooperate. Another public meeting was called with Captain Ayres present, and there were estimated 8,000 attendees. This is what the Pennsylvania Gazette says, 8,000 attendees, who voted that the captain should not enter the ship at the customs house and should return to London as soon as possible. Now, here we have another declaration from the Gazette, quote, "This meeting is allowed by all to be the most respectable," here we are again, "both in the numbers and rank of those who attended it that has been known in this city." So it's a respectable meeting and high-ranking people. It's not the rabble. It's really everybody who counts in Philadelphia. So in sum, says the Gazette, the whole business was conducted with a decorum and order worthy the importance of the cause. And Captain Ayres promised he would comply with the city's wishes. People then obtained, quote, "a proper supply of necessities and fresh provisions." And I've seen indication that this was paid for by the tea consignees. And the ship weighed anchor to return to London. Ayres and Berkeley were, quote, "attended to the wharf by a concourse of people who wished them a good voyage." You can imagine everybody's, yes, goodbye. Goodbye, Ayres and Berkeley. We're really glad you're gone. So the Gazette pronounced it, quote, "so glorious an exertion of public virtue and spirit that had been brought to a happy end, by which the, quote, the force of a law founded upon a right of taxing the Americans without their consent had been effectually broken, and the foundations of American liberty more deeply laid than ever." That's the end of the Gazette's account. Now, the customs officers' account, addressed to their superiors in the immediate aftermath of the ship's departure, was rather different. Defending their non-intervention in the events they witnessed, they declared that, quote, "it was totally out of our power to prevent those proceedings, and our interference, unassisted and unsupported as it would have been, would only have endangered ourselves and provoked the populace to more violence. For though this town seems to have been pretty cool and regular, yet it was not less determined in its opposition to this measure than any other town in America," end quote. Now, on a side note, I've been talking about timing, so it's interesting that the notation on this report is very interesting and relevant. The report was dated December 28th, Philadelphia. It reached their superiors in Boston on January 21st. They didn't have a committee to send it. And London on March 12th of 1774. So it was not until March 12th of 1774 that the people in London found out what the customs officers were saying about what had happened in Philadelphia. And I'm sorry, I can't tell you, I don't remember exactly when it was when the Philadelphia tea ship got back to London, but I can tell you that Berkeley spent the voyage figuring out how he could save some money on the tea, and he proposed it to the East India Company when he got there, and they said no. So that was the end of that. Now, James Madison commended the results in a letter to a Philadelphia friend, quote, "I congratulate you on your heroic proceedings in Philadelphia with regard to the tea. I wish Boston may conduct matters with as much discretion as they seem to do with boldness," end quote. When they learned what had happened, others like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, the latter months later because he was in London, also lamented the Bostonians' acts. In fact, Franklin, this is not known at all, or widely known, Franklin for nearly a year was advising his Boston friends to compensate the East India Company for the tea that had been destroyed. To many contemporaries, the peaceful but definitive results in Philadelphia seemed preferable to destruction in Boston Harbor. Now, you might well ask what happened to the other two tea ships I've mentioned very briefly. The ship bound for New York was blown to the Caribbean by the same gale that wrecked the fourth Boston ship on the Cape. So it spent the winter in Antigua. That captain, learning accurately what had happened in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, wrote ahead to New Yorkers in the late winter to tell them he would come to resupply his vessel in New Jersey, but would do nothing else before returning to London. He knew what to do. Don't try to enter the harbor. And that's what he did in April 1774. Just as in Philadelphia, a crowd in New Jersey, when he landed, wished him a good voyage and shouted loud huzzahs at the departure of his ship. So in all of these events, I found that studying the shipwreck on the Cape which other books barely mentioned, if at all, and its aftermath especially enlightening. Some of the tea that had been wrecked on the Cape remained there, and some of it was sold on the Cape. Some of it was used to pay the workers who unloaded the ship after it was wrecked. Others was sold to people. Just about everybody lost their tea to mobs, except for two elite men who split a chest of tea between them and sold it. And people bought it. People bought it. So the modding, so there was chaos, literal chaos on Cape Cod. I've written an article about this. It's in a new book that is just out from the Omohundro Institute in Williamsburg, of a collection of articles. My article originally appeared in the Wayman Murray Quarterly, but it's reprinted in this book, which is called The American Revolution, logically enough. And it's just coming out, along with a number of other articles that have been published through the Omohundro Institute. I was just delighted when they told me that they'd picked this article about the chaos on the Cape, because it was one of my favorite pieces of research ever. I had, of course, to go to the Cape and look at the site of the shipwreck, which was fascinating. So anyway, the chaos on the Cape lasted for months. You can read about it briefly in the book 1774, or at greater length in this article. The mobbings and arguments appeared or persisted into late summer 1774, and showed me what could have happened had the tea been landed elsewhere. Accordingly, it revealed the wisdom of the tactic that Benjamin Rush had suggested months earlier. Rush was right. Your Philadelphian was right. The idea was to prevent the tea from landing in the first place. Not necessarily destroying it, but preventing it from landing. And that, of course, is what the Philadelphians and the New Yorkers did by not allowing the ships to enter their harbors, and thus not activating the 20-day customs deadline. Now, Americans' understanding of the tea controversy to this day erroneously sees Boston's action as emblematic of the colonists' response to the tea. But let me pose a counterfactual question. What would it mean if Americans today recognized that Americans varied in their tactics in dealing with the tea ships in 1773? If they knew that Philadelphia had avoided conflict, albeit by threatening and intimidating the consignees and the tea ship captain, and if historians had not emphasized Bostonians' actions while ignoring and downplaying the events here and in Charleston and New York, what if Americans understood that during the events that are seen as important precursors to the Revolutionary War, the colonists were not, in fact, united in opposition to the tea, or in opposition in supporting the destruction of the tea as opposed to other means of opposition? But what if we understood that colonists then had many political disagreements, just as we do today? So in the end, we might conclude from these events in late 1773 and early 1774 that timing was in fact everything. When things happened had a lot to do with how and why they happened. Just think of the different reactions to the East India Company tea and how important dates have proved to be in my narrative. From the nearly simultaneous incidents in Charleston and Boston, the Cape Cod shipwreck, the importance of the 20-day rule in the customs statutes, and the crucial significance of Philadelphians and New Yorkers knowing what had happened in Boston before their tea ships arrived. That was absolutely crucial. So that timing understood my interpretations as a historian, and as I said at the outset of this talk, I attribute that to my decision from the beginning to prioritize contemporary 18th century knowledge of my subject rather than subsequent interpretations by historians. I think that's a proper historical observation, and with that, I'll end this talk and open it up for questions.
Wow, that was amazing. And I just am in awe of Professor Norton's research, the meticulous way that she went over the course of decades, gathering all these facts and interpreting them. And I invite you to read her book, 1774, if you have not, because she takes us deeper into the story.
Right. In fact, not everything that was in the talk tonight is in the book, I can tell you. I looked up more stuff on Philadelphia for talk tonight.
So, and I thank her also for placing Philadelphia at the center.
Right.
I am going to preempt the Q&A because we're a bit behind.
Oh, okay.
What we want to do is invite you downstairs to see the exhibition. There are 141 original items on view, some of them in facsimile only for conservation reasons, including this painting that you've been looking at on the screen and which Professor Norton taught us about this evening. So you'll have a chance to visit with her casually downstairs. Let's give her a chance to get a bite to eat and a cold drink first. But please enjoy the social time that we have now and the chance to see the collection. The cases have drawers, so the decks of the cases are only a quarter of the exhibition. So it will take some time. We invite you back after tonight because I think you'll want to see more of what's on view. Again, I want to thank my colleague, Bill Ewald, for working with me on this project. And we'll also be downstairs to chat with you and answer questions. Thank you so much. There's an elevator over here, the stairs over here. We'll see you downstairs. And thank you, Professor Norton.